Here is where I lay out all of my pieces so I can start making the face of the cabinet door. Here is where I cut the thumb and groove for the door and the body. A sample of the joinery that I'm going to be using, a tongue and groove. I started to glue up the face frame, the doors here, and the reason why you see a joint in the middle of it is because I was using Brazilian cherry hardwood floor pieces. I didn't have long enough, so I had to put a joint in the middle. Here I'm sanding. Here I started to glue up the body of the cabinet. Then I had to make sure it's square. So I glued it up. And then I put in the top frame on, and then I squared it out and make sure all the edges line up. Next, I put the mirror face down and I started to mark out where I need to cut a little channel. I also forgot to film where I had to cut another one that's right behind the glass so I can put in a back panel. Here I'm sanding. Next, I started to put in the back panel to mark it out so that way I can cut it accordingly. Here is where I basically dry fit the whole mirror and the back panel. Just a little demonstration how it's going to come together. Here is where I'm using a spline jig to reinforce the edges. Here is where I'm cutting the splines and I'm using white oak. Here's where I mark them out, multiple pieces out of one sheet, and basically take them to the bandsaw and rough cut them. Glue them up and let them dry before I cut them off. Here's where I'm routing out a channel for the back panel to fit into. Here's where I'm measuring the size of the back panel. Here's where I dry fit the back panel. You can see on top and the bottom my piece wasn't long enough for about 1.5 inches, so I had to double it up a little bit so that way it can be reinforced a little better. Afterwards, I laid down the fabric, used a little bit of spray adhesive to attach it to the back panel. Repeated the same process on the other side. After drying for about a few minutes, I flipped it over and cut off the excess fabric. Then I did the same thing for the panel that holds the mirror in. I lost the footage where I was gluing up the other side of the panel. Here I'm demonstrating what the panel would look like coming together. Here I'm treating the wood with boiled linseed oil, about 1 coat so far. I hope this scene doesn't make you sick, but I was playing around with my GoPro. After about 10 minutes, I wiped the wood down. Here I'm cutting down the frame for the foam that's gonna hold the rings in. After cutting out the pieces, I come over to the foam piece and basically do a rough estimate for the foam to fit into it snugly. Here I also lost the footage of me actually nailing it together. I basically used butt joints and some nails. Here I'm just dry fitting the piece of foam to see how snugly it actually fits, and then quick sand down. The pieces that I'm cutting right now, those are going to receive a hooks on them so you can hang jewelry. I cut them a little too thin, so I had to just double them up. I laid down some masking tape, that way I can mark where my hooks need to be without actually having to write on the wood and then later sanding it down. Then I use my calipers to actually measure out what the thread of the hooks are going to be and just pick a drill bit that's going to be just a little bit smaller so that way the threads can fit in really good. Next I took it over to my drill press and just quickly drilled them. Sanding. Next I'm laying out where I'm going to be screwing the panel into the jewelry cabinet itself, and I'm countersinking the little screws so they can fit flush. Just a little test to see if it's flush. Next, I treated it with boiled linseed oil. After about 5 minutes, I wipe them down. Next, I started to put the whole jewelry cabinet back together upside down without putting the back panel in. And what I wanted to do is basically figure out the tray, the height of it, so that way whenever you actually close the face frame, you're not actually hitting it. So that way it clears it pretty good. This tray is a little thin, so I had to use a little bit of wood glue, a little bit super glue. I'm not very impressed that I made it that thin, but it works. Next, I lay out the hinges. And now I'm just using the calipers to measure the hinges and then basically make a little mark on the panel to see where I need to router out a little groove. After I use the calipers to mark, I actually use the utility knife to actually cut through the wood a little bit. Then I check the thickness of the hinges and I mark how deep down I need to router it. Using a little scrap piece to do a little test to see if I have the router set properly. Next I'm using a hole puncher to see where I need to pre-drill the little screws so that way it doesn't split the hardwood. I'm just lining up the hinges. I just did those. My little mark and then router out a gap so that way it sits a little bit more flush. 1, 2, 3, 4. After that I repeat the same process on the door frame. Next I put the two pieces together to see if it actually fits into the groove, and then I open up the door frame, pre-drilled the rest of the screws, and put a few screws in, opened it up and closed it to see if it fit good, and then I added in the rest of the screws. Since it was a little too short, I glued this piece in, and then I glued a wider piece in to hold it together, and then you have another 1/4 inch thick here, and when it wouldn't sit flush up against the wall, so I thought I'd put another one back there. And then once I did that, I wrapped it around with the fabric. Well, didn't really like the way it looked, so I routed it out between the staples and then chipped it out, and you can't see this, it's pretty flush now. I wish I didn't waste almost an hour taking it out, but I did, so now it's going to sit flush up against the wall. Next, I put in the back panel. I pre-drilled it and screwed it down. Next, I put the mirror down carefully, then put the back panel in that holds the mirror in, and then pre-drilled and screwed down the panel. Next, I don't know the name for them, but the pieces that are going to be holding the hooks, I basically measure them out accordingly and basically screw them down. Now they're wider than the mirror, so they're not actually going to be hitting the mirror. They're wider, the mirror is shorter. Next, I lay down the little piece that's going to be holding the rings. I measured it out, make sure it's square in the middle, and then removed the piece of foam, marked it, and pre-drilled the holes down into where the screws are going to go to hold the little piece in. A little bit of spray adhesive to hold the foam down. And then I laid out all of my pieces, and then the little piece that's going to be holding the earrings in where I need to make the notches, I basically mark it out exactly where I need them. Took it over to the table saw using the sled. I basically make out the notches. Then I put them inside the jewelry cabinet and then measured to put 2 pieces on either side to raise them off the bottom. Here I'm just pre-drilling and trying to screw the pieces in together, not actually putting it into the back panel just yet, just to see if it's square and good. After screwing the pieces together, I check make sure it's square, and then putting it inside the jewelry cabinet, and then taking out the 4 screws on each corner and putting in the longer screws, that way it can hold inside the panel. Next, I measure out the pieces that are going to be holding the shorter jewelry and screw them down. Next, I center the trays and screw them down to the back panel. Alrighty, and this is the jewelry box I was working on right here. So it's Brazilian cherry with the mirror in the front. There's me. And then when you open it up, these are gonna get hooks, so that way you can hang your long jewelry. These are gonna get hooks, but it's for shorter jewelry. This is for your rings, so you can put in your rings. And then these are for your earrings, and just hook them up on there. And then this is your drawer for whatever you need. Just loose stuff. Right? That's a jewelry cabinet I built. Next I use a big bolt. I chop off the end and cut a little channel inside, so that way I can mount it into my drill and then basically screw down the little hook. A little time lapse of me screwing down the little hooks. And the jewelry cabinet is finished. I still ordered a little bit of hooks that are still coming, but I can do that once it's attached to the wall. So I take it up to the master bedroom, and here you can see my wife's previous jewelry cabinet. It was a little tiny one. She kind of outgrew that, so I had to build her a new one. Thank you for clicking on my video. Click on my channel to view some more videos. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you.